This 4-year-old street urchin finds a millionaire with his newborn son in his arms, both left to die in a flash flood by a mysterious man. But she extends her hand to him and a miracle happens. Comment with a score from 0 to 10 for my story. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The rain lashed against the streets of the bustling metropolis with a ferocity that seemed intent on washing away all the city's sins. Dark waters surged through the gutters, carrying trash, shattered dreams, and abandoned hopes, as a small 4-year-old girl huddled beneath the awning of a shuttered storefront. Her wide, frightened eyes scanned the surrounding chaos, but her mouth remained sealed in a silence that had lasted for months. She was so tiny and fragile that she appeared to be only 2. Her dark hair clung to her gaunt face, and her tattered clothes barely shielded her from the bone-chilling cold. In her small, dirty hands, she clutched a plastic bag filled with crumpled aluminum cans, the result of an entire day's labor on the city's unforgiving streets. The storm had arrived without warning, transforming the streets into raging rivers. Abandoned cars floated like broken toys, and the deafening roar of the water mingled with the desperate cries of people seeking shelter. It was in this apocalyptic scene that she saw a tall man staggering through the water, cradling something precious against his chest. The 30-year-old businessman looked like he had just walked out of a magazine. Dark brown hair, perfectly styled even in the rain, a strong jawline, and an athletic build that he couldn't hide despite the desperation. His expensive clothes, now soaked and filthy, still hinted at his privileged background. In his arms, he protected a newborn baby who was crying inconsolably. The man stumbled and nearly fell into the current that had formed on Main Street. His eyes, normally confident due to the millions he had amassed through investments in stocks and real estate, now reflected only terror and confusion. He looked around as if he didn't recognize the world, as if he had woken up in a nightmare from which he couldn't escape. The girl watched as he leaned against a lamppost, panting and lost. The baby continued to cry, and she could see that the man didn't know what to do. There was something devastatingly vulnerable about that moment. One of the city's most successful businessmen, with a net worth in dollars that few could imagine, now completely helpless on the streets, she knew like the back of her hand. It was then that she saw the hooded figure. A large man dressed in dark clothes approached them from the side of a building. Even from a distance, she could make out the glint of something in his hand, something that made her blood run cold. Her most terrible memories began to resurface, bringing back images that her childish mind desperately tried to forget. The hooded man shoved the businessman hard, causing him and the baby to almost be swept away by the current. He yelled something that was lost in the noise of the storm, but his body language made it clear that it was a threat. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he disappeared into the shadows of the buildings, leaving the man and the baby completely alone amidst the chaos. The girl remained still for a few seconds, watching the scene. Her mind quickly processed the options. She could simply hide and wait for the storm to pass, as she always did. But something about that crying baby struck a sensitive chord in her wounded heart. Perhaps it was the memory of her own interrupted childhood, or perhaps it was simply the compassion that still remained in her scarred soul. Without making a sound, she emerged from her temporary shelter and walked to where the man was struggling against the current. Her small feet knew every pothole, every uneven surface of the streets. Months of living there had taught her to navigate the city like no one else could. When she got close to him, she extended her small, dirty hand. The businessman looked at her with surprise and desperation. He saw a child even smaller than the baby in his arms, offering help when he, with all his capital and influence, couldn't even find a safe place to take cover. For a moment he hesitated. His entire life had been built on control, planning, and financial power. Accepting help from a street girl would have wounded his pride under normal circumstances. But there was nothing normal about that situation. The baby needed urgent care, the storm showed no signs of abating, and he was completely lost in that urban labyrinth that had become hostile and unknown. With a sigh of surrender, he grasped the small, outstretched hand. She guided him through the flooded streets with impressive confidence. She knew every alley, every passage, every place where the water didn't flow with such force. Her movements were calculated and precise, as if she had a mental map of every inch of that part of the city. The businessman wondered how such a small child had acquired such knowledge of urban survival. They walked for almost 15 minutes until they reached an old bridge that crossed one of the city's smaller rivers. Beneath the concrete structure, protected from the floodwaters by a small natural elevation of the terrain, there was a makeshift shelter. Cardboard boxes carefully arranged, some old but clean blankets, and even some bottles of drinking water stored with care. That was where she lived. Her small kingdom of survival, built with the precision of someone who had learned that every detail could mean the difference between living and perishing. The businessman looked around, impressed by the organization and functionality of the space. Even with all his wealth and resources, he wouldn't know how to build something so efficient in extreme circumstances. The girl gestured for him to sit on one of the sturdier boxes and took a clean cloth from her reserves. With delicate movements, she began to dry the baby, who had stopped crying as soon as he got out of the rain. Her gestures revealed an impressive maternal care for someone so young, as if she already had experience in caring for even smaller children. It was at that moment, watching that fragile but determined girl taking care of his son, that the businessman realized the magnitude of what had happened in his life. A few hours earlier, he controlled a financial empire with diversified investments and profits that grew monthly. Now, he was sheltered under a bridge, depending on the kindness of a street child to protect his newborn baby. He tried to access his banking apps on his cell phone, which miraculously still worked despite the water. The screen showed error messages, blocked accounts, denied access. His identity was being questioned by the financial system as if he had simply ceased to exist in the digital world that he once controlled with mastery. While he was trying to understand what was happening, the girl continued to take care of the baby with a tenderness that contrasted brutally with the harshness of her reality. She didn't speak, she didn't make any sound, but her eyes communicated more than 1,000 words. There was suffering there, a deep pain that a child shouldn't know, but there was also a silent strength that was impressive. The storm outside continued relentlessly, and the businessman began to realize that this wouldn't be just any night. His life, so carefully built on foundations of gold and power, had crumbled in a matter of hours. And now, at the lowest point of his existence, he had found a small guardian who seemed to know survival secrets that his degrees and investments could never teach him. The baby finally fell asleep in the girl's arms, who swaddled him with a disconcerting naturalness. And it was there, in that makeshift shelter under a bridge, that two completely different lives met at the exact moment when both needed a miracle the most. The dawn brought with it a heavy silence that contrasted with the chaos of the previous night. The businessman woke up with a sore body, still trying to process whether it had all been a terrible nightmare. But the smell of moisture, the cold concrete against his back, and the distant sound of traffic confirmed the brutal reality. He was living under a bridge, depending on the generosity of a street child. The little one was already awake, sitting silently while watching the baby sleep in her arms. Her big eyes seemed even deeper in the daylight, revealing an astonishingly precocious maturity. She moved carefully, as if any sound could break the fragile peace of that moment. The businessman tried again to access his bank accounts, but the situation had worsened during the night. Now notifications appeared about ongoing investigations, asset freezes, and suspicions of large-scale fraud. His name, which had previously opened doors in the most exclusive circles of society, was now associated with crimes that he did not even understand. His reserves in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies were also inaccessible. The security codes had been changed, the digital wallets blocked. Decades of hard work building a solid fortune had evaporated in a matter of hours, as if an invisible force had decided to erase his financial existence. The girl got up slowly and gestured for him to follow her. She carried the baby with impressive naturalness, as if she had done it 1,000 times before. They left the shelter and walked through the streets that still showed the scars of the storm. Abandoned cars, scattered trash, and standing water in several places. She led him to a small corner bakery, where an elderly gentleman with a grey moustache was arranging the morning's bread. When he saw the girl approaching, his face lit up with a genuine smile. It was evident that the two knew each other well, and there was a special connection between them that transcended words. The baker looked at the businessman with curiosity, but did not ask questions. He simply handed a bag of warm bread and a bottle of milk to the girl, refusing any payment with a loving gesture. She nodded in thanks and went to a table in the back of the bakery, where she indicated for the businessman to sit. As they shared the simple but nutritious breakfast, he watched how she interacted with the other people in the neighborhood. A gentleman who was passing by the street waved to her familiarly. A lady, sweeping the sidewalk, left a small coin on the bakery counter, a discreet gesture but clearly directed at the girl. A teenage girl, who worked as a delivery person, stopped to check if she was okay. It was fascinating to discover that this seemingly abandoned child had built a complex network of relationships in the community. People knew her, cared about her, and somehow contributed to her survival. She wasn't just a street girl. She was part of the social fabric of that neighborhood, accepted and protected by an invisible but real family. The baby began to show signs of discomfort during the morning. First there were small moans, then more intense crying. When the businessman touched his forehead, he realized it was too hot. Panic took over him. Without access to his resources, without a working health plan, without even a valid document to prove his identity, how could he seek medical help for his son? The girl noticed his anguish immediately. She took the baby carefully and left the bakery, indicating for him to follow her. They walked for several blocks until they reached an old 2-story house painted blue, where a small sign announced "Community Pharmacy." The girl knocked on the side door of the establishment with a specific pattern: 3 short knocks, pause, 2 long knocks. A lady of approximately 60 years opened the door. She had grey hair tied in a simple bun and wore a white apron over a floral dress. Her kind eyes immediately became worried when she saw the feverish baby in the girl's arms. Without hesitating, she invited them in. The interior of the pharmacy was cozy and organized. Shelves full of medicines mingled with dried medicinal plants and bottles of homemade remedies. The lady, who introduced herself only as Mrs. Rosa, examined the baby with professional knowledge. Her experienced hands checked temperature, reflexes, and vital signs with precision. "It's a mild respiratory infection," she diagnosed after a few minutes. "Common in newborns exposed to moisture. Nothing serious if treated properly." She went to the shelves and separated some medications, explaining dosages and necessary care. When the businessman tried to talk about payment, she simply shook her head. "The little one has already done so much for our community," said Mrs. Rosa, gently stroking the girl's face. "That's how things work here. One helps the other without expecting anything in return." At that moment, the businessman began to understand something that his years of privileged education and business experience had never taught him. There was a parallel economic system based not on profit and capital accumulation, but on solidarity and mutual cooperation. The girl did not own money, stocks, or properties, but she had something much more valuable: trust and genuine relationships. During the way back, she made an unexpected stop at a one-story house with a well-kept garden. She waved to a middle-aged woman who was watering plants on the porch, who immediately came to the gate. After a few gestures from the girl and worried looks at the baby, the woman disappeared inside the house and returned with clean baby clothes and a warm blanket. "For the little one," she said with a loving smile, handing the items to the girl. "And there is more here whenever you need it." It was impressive how that fragile child had managed to build a support infrastructure that worked better than many official systems. She knew who had medicine, who had clothes, who offered food, who provided temporary shelter. She was a master of urban survival, navigating the city with resources that did not appear on any balance sheet. Back at the shelter under the bridge, the businessman administered the medication to the baby according to Mrs. Rosa's instructions. The fever began to subside gradually, and the little one went back to sleep peacefully. It was during these moments of silence that he tried to reconstruct the events that had led to his financial ruin. His memories were fragmented and confusing. He remembered a heated argument in his office, documents being signed under pressure, urgent phone calls about transfers of large sums of money. There was someone else involved, a shadowy figure who seemed to control everything from behind the scenes, manipulating situations and people like pieces on a chessboard. The girl watched his efforts to understand what had happened. From time to time, she tilted her head as if she wanted to communicate something important, but her mouth remained sealed in the silence that defined her. Her eyes, however, spoke volumes. There was something she knew, something she had witnessed, but she could not or would not express. When the afternoon arrived, she got up and indicated that she would go out again. This time, she gestured for him to stay and take care of the baby. It was the first time she had completely entrusted him with the responsibility for the child, a sign that she had developed some level of trust in the desperate businessman. She returned a few hours later, carrying enough coins to pay for a few hours of internet at a nearby internet cafe. How she had gotten that money, he had no idea, but he suspected that it involved her mysterious network of contacts in the neighborhood. With urgent gestures, she led him to the establishment where he was finally able to properly investigate his financial situation. What he discovered left him completely shocked. $1 million transfers had been made in his name to accounts in tax havens. Fraudulent contracts appeared with his forged signature. Investments in shell companies consumed his funds, and suspicious operations involving his applications in euros and dollars were being investigated by financial regulators. Someone had carefully orchestrated his destruction, using his credentials and access to build an elaborate scheme of money laundering and tax evasion. His fortune had not simply disappeared. It had been systematically stolen and redistributed, while he was turned into the perfect scapegoat for crimes that he did not even fully understand. While he was analyzing the digital documents, the girl approached the computer screen. Her eyes fixed on a specific signature on the fraudulent contracts, and her expression changed drastically. For the first time since they met, she showed an intense emotion, not fear or sadness, but a deep and silent anger that completely transformed her childish face. She took a piece of paper and began to draw frantically. Her small hands moved with urgency, creating lines and shapes that gradually revealed a complex symbol, an ornate crest with specific details that she reproduced with impressive precision. It was evident that this image was engraved in her memory with frightening clarity. The businessman looked at the drawing and felt a chill run down his spine. He recognized that symbol. It was the family crest of his majority partner, the man who had helped build his financial empire and who now, apparently, was behind his complete destruction. The discovery of the family crest changed everything. The businessman fixed his eyes on the drawing made by the girl, feeling as if all the pieces of a macabre puzzle were finally beginning to fit together. His majority partner, the man who had been his business partner for over 5 years, was behind all that systematic destruction. The girl continued drawing with feverish intensity, her small hands trembling slightly as she added details to the symbol. It was as if she was reliving a traumatic memory, forcing herself to reproduce every line, every curve, every element of that crest that clearly had a terrible meaning for her. The businessman remembered the recent meetings with his partner, the discussions about new investments, the pressures to sign urgent documents without adequate time for analysis. Everything had been carefully orchestrated, an elaborate trap that he had fallen headfirst into, blindly trusting someone he considered a friend and loyal partner. When they left the internet cafe, the girl guided him along a different path back to the shelter. She seemed agitated, constantly looking over her shoulder as if she expected to be followed. Her movements were more cautious than usual, and she chose alleys and less crowded passages, demonstrating an instinct for self-preservation sharpened by experience. Back at the refuge under the bridge, she took more papers and began a series of drawings that left the businessman completely perplexed. They were not just childish scribbles. They were detailed illustrations that told a complex visual story. Dark cars, men in suits, a pregnant woman running, scenes of violence that a 4-year-old should not know, much less be able to reproduce with such precision. The baby was sleeping peacefully after taking the medication, his breathing finally regular and his temperature normal. This gave the businessman time to carefully study each drawing that the girl produced. There was a clear narrative emerging from those images, a sequence of events that seemed to document not only his own tragedy, but also hers. One drawing showed a long-haired woman holding a newborn baby, being chased by shadowy figures. Another portrayed a tall man in a suit, being pushed in the rain, clearly representing what had happened to him the night before. And there were older, more traumatic images, showing a small girl hiding while watching scenes of violence that explained her mutism. The girl stopped drawing and looked directly into his eyes. For the first time, her facial expressions became more communicative, as if she was desperately trying to convey crucial information without using words. She pointed to the drawing of the pregnant woman, then to the sleeping baby, and finally to himself. The businessman felt his heart stop for a moment. The implications of that gesture were terrifying. The woman in the drawing, would that be his wife? He had been informed that she had not survived childbirth, a tragedy that he was still processing amidst the chaos of his destroyed life. But what if that was also an elaborate lie? With trembling hands, he picked up his cell phone and tried to access information about the hospital where his wife had given birth. The records were confusing, with inconsistencies that he had not noticed before in his state of shock and despair. The signatures on the medical documents seemed forged, and some dates did not match his memory of the events. The girl continued her drawings, now showing even more specific scenes. A dark van, an abandoned warehouse, an injured woman being cared for by someone in a white coat. It was as if she was creating a visual map of events she had witnessed, guiding him through a truth that no one else knew. During the night, while she slept leaning against the concrete wall with the baby in her arms, the businessman remained awake, trying to process all those revelations. His wife might be alive. His partner had planned not only to steal his fortune, but to completely destroy his life. And a traumatized street girl was the only witness to crimes that could change everything. The next day, the girl surprised him by leading him to a completely different location. She led him through a series of residential streets until they reached a modest apartment complex, where she waved to a middle-aged man who was repairing bicycles in a small makeshift workshop in the garage. The man, thin and with hands calloused from manual labor, smiled when he saw her approaching. It was evident that they had an established relationship. He put away his tools and approached them with genuine familiarity. The girl gestured animatedly, showing him the drawings she had made. and the man studied each image with growing attention. "She has a photographic memory," the man explained to the businessman, his voice filled with admiration and sadness. "She can remember details that adults would forget in minutes. It's an impressive ability, but also a curse when you witness terrible things." The businessman learned that the man was known in the neighborhood as Old Man Joe, and had become a kind of unofficial protector of the girl. He explained that she had appeared in the area months ago, clearly traumatized and unable to speak. The local community had gradually adopted her, each person contributing in some way to her survival. "She sees everything," Old Man Joe continued, watching as the girl organized her drawings in chronological sequence. "People don't pay attention to children, especially street children. They become invisible, silent witnesses to things that the powerful prefer to keep hidden." The girl showed Old Man Joe the drawing of the family crest, and his expression became grave. He recognized the symbol, not just as a decoration, but as a mark of ownership. He explained that he had seen that crest on cars that circulated through the neighborhood during the early hours of the morning, always associated with suspicious activities that the local residents preferred to ignore for safety. "There's an abandoned warehouse in the industrial zone," he said, lowering his voice. "The street kids talk about strange movement over there. Expensive cars arriving in the early morning, people being taken inside, screams that can sometimes be heard from afar." The girl nodded vigorously, picking up a pencil to draw a rudimentary but surprisingly accurate map of the region. She marked streets, landmarks, and even specific times when there was more movement at the location. It was an impressive intelligence job for a child her age. The businessman realized that he was facing a unique opportunity. His wife might be being held in that warehouse. The documents that proved his innocence might be hidden there, but he also knew that it was an extremely dangerous situation. People with enough resources to destroy a financial empire would not hesitate to eliminate any threat. Old Man Joe offered help, but made it clear that it would be limited. "The police aren't going to believe drawings from a mute girl," he said with bitter realism. "And even if they did, these people have enough influence to make any investigation disappear." The girl picked up another piece of paper and began to draw something different. Specific faces of people she had seen at the warehouse. Her artistic skills were impressive, creating recognizable portraits with details that could identify specific individuals. One of the faces was clearly his majority partner, but there were others that the businessman did not recognize. During the afternoon, she led him to a strategic observation point, the top of an abandoned building, from where it was possible to see the industrial warehouse in the distance. Using binoculars that Old Man Joe had lent him, the businessman was able to confirm that there was movement at the location. Cars arrived and left at specific times, always with tinted windows and license plates that seemed fake. The girl pointed to a specific pattern. 3 cars always arrived together at 6 in the evening, remained for approximately 2 hours, and left in different directions. It was a coordinated and regular operation, suggesting that something important happened at that specific time. While they were observing, she made more drawings showing the interior of the warehouse as she remembered it. There were makeshift divisions, an area that looked like a temporary office, and a section that she drew with special care. A small room with a bed, where a woman remained lying down most of the time. The businessman's heart raced. The woman in the drawing had physical characteristics that perfectly matched his wife. The shape of her face, the length of her hair, even the way she positioned herself when sleeping were identical. There was no doubt his wife was alive and being held prisoner at that location, but the girl had not yet finished her visual revelation. The last drawing in the series showed something that made him question everything he thought he knew about his situation. On the paper, she had drawn a woman in a white coat taking care of the prisoner, and that woman was wearing a specific badge that he immediately recognized. It was the badge from the hospital where his wife had supposedly given birth and perished. The nurse, who had cared for her during childbirth, was apparently involved in the kidnapping, keeping her alive but a prisoner. The entire scenario of mourning and tragedy had been an elaborate staging to cover up a much more complex crime. The girl carefully put away her drawings and looked at him with an expression that mixed determination and fear. It was evident that she understood the gravity of the situation and was willing to help him, despite the obvious risks. But it was also clear that a traumatized child and a ruined businessman would have little chance against a well-structured criminal organization with abundant resources. While they were returning to the shelter under the bridge, the businessman wondered how such an elaborate operation could be dismantled without putting even more lives at risk. The early hours of the morning brought with it a discovery that would completely change the course of events. The businessman woke up to the sound of low whispers coming from outside the shelter. The girl was awake, gesturing silently to someone who remained hidden in the shadows of the bridge. It was the first time that he had seen her interacting with another person in such an intimate and trusting way. When the figure in the shadows approached, it revealed itself to be a teenager of approximately 15 years, thin and agile, with dark clothes that helped him blend into the urban shadows. His eyes were intelligent and alert, and he moved with the same characteristic caution as people who have lived on the streets for a long time. The young man communicated with the girl through an improvised sign language that both mastered perfectly. It was fascinating to observe how they had developed a complex communication system that allowed for detailed conversations without making a single sound. The businessman realized that he was witnessing a survival network much more sophisticated than he had imagined. After a few minutes of silent communication, the teenager addressed the businessman with an impressive maturity for his age. "She told me about you and the baby," he said, his voice low but firm. "And about the drawings she made. There are things that you need to know about what's happening in the city." The young man introduced himself simply as Rip, and explained that he coordinated an informal network of street children and teenagers who helped each other. They shared information, resources, and especially security, creating a support system that worked better than many official institutions. "The children see everything," Rip explained, echoing the words of Old Man Joe. "We are invisible to adults, especially to rich and powerful adults. They do business in front of us, thinking that we are just part of the urban landscape." The girl showed her drawings to Rip, who studied them with professional attention. He recognized not only the warehouse and the cars, but also some of the people portrayed. Apparently, that criminal operation was not new to the Street Children's Network. They had been observing and documenting suspicious activities for weeks. "There's more," Rip said, pulling a small, tattered notebook from his pocket. "Other children have made notes about times, license plates, people who come and go. You're not the only ones being targeted by these people." The notebook contained detailed information that impressed the businessman with its precision and organization. There were records of at least 3 other families who had disappeared in similar circumstances, always preceded by sudden financial problems and blocked bank accounts. The pattern was consistent: people with significant assets being systematically destroyed and then eliminated. "It's a big operation," Rip continued. "They choose businessmen with a lot of money but few political connections, people who can disappear without causing too much noise. They steal everything, make it look like the person committed crimes, and then people simply vanish." The girl picked up her pencil and began to draw again, this time creating a diagram that showed the structure of the criminal organization. At the top was the family crest that she had memorized, and below it a hierarchy of people involved. The businessman recognized some faces, not only his majority partner, but also a lawyer who had worked on his recent transactions and an accountant who had access to his financial information. "Your wife found out something," Rip said, observing the drawings. "That's why they couldn't just kill her." She must have evidence or information that they need, or maybe something that could destroy them if it comes to light. The businessman remembered that his wife had been strangely worried in the weeks before childbirth. She asked questions about certain business transactions, questioned the legitimacy of some contracts, and had mentioned several times that something was not right with the business. He had attributed these concerns to pregnancy hormones, but now he realized that she had identified signs of problems long before he had. Rip explained that the street children had developed a plan to document the activities at the warehouse more systematically. "We have small cameras," he said, showing some basic digital devices. "Nothing sophisticated, but enough to record evidence. The problem is that we need someone with credibility to present this evidence to the authorities." "But I don't have credibility," the businessman protested. "My identity is destroyed. My accounts are blocked. Who's going to believe me?" The girl picked up another piece of paper and drew something that completely surprised him. It was a safe with specific numbers and symbols that she reproduced with photographic accuracy. Next to the safe, she drew documents with official seals and signatures that he recognized as belonging to financial authorities. "She saw where they keep the originals," Rip explained, interpreting the drawings. "The documents that prove you were tricked, and probably evidence of other crimes, too." The businessman studied the drawing carefully. The safe was located in an office that seemed familiar. He had been in that location before, during meetings with his majority partner. It was his private office, a space that was supposedly used only for confidential meetings and the storage of important documents. The girl continued drawing, now showing a temporal sequence. The original documents had been removed from the safe on specific dates, copied and altered, and then returned to the original location. The entire fraud process had been carefully documented, probably as insurance against betrayal among the criminals involved. "They didn't destroy the evidence because they need it as mutual protection," Rip observed. "It's typical of this type of organization. Nobody trusts anyone, so everyone keeps evidence that can destroy the partners if necessary." During the rest of the morning, the group developed a risky but potentially effective plan. The street children would continue monitoring the warehouse where the businessman's wife was being held, documenting times and security routines. Simultaneously, they would try to access the office where the original documents were kept. The girl drew a detailed map of the building where the office was located, including escape routes and security blind spots that she had observed during previous visits. Her observation and visual memory skills were proving increasingly impressive, providing information that would be impossible to obtain by other means. Rip explained that they would have a limited window of opportunity. "The movement at the warehouse always decreases on Thursday afternoons," he said. "That's when most of the important people meet at another location to make payments and distribute profits. If we're going to act, it has to be at that time." The businessman felt a mixture of hope and terror. For the first time since his life had crumbled, there was a real possibility of not only recovering his wife and proving his innocence, but also of exposing a criminal organization that had destroyed several families. But the risk was enormous. If they were discovered, there would be no second chance. The girl took his small, dirty hand, squeezing it with surprising strength. Her big eyes communicated a steely determination, as if she was saying that she was not afraid of danger. There was something deeply moving about that gesture. A child who had lost everything, who had not spoken for months due to trauma, was willing to risk her life to help strangers. During the rest of the day, they refined the details of the plan. The girl would use her infiltration skills to enter the office through a bathroom window that she had identified as a weak point in the security. Meanwhile, Rip would coordinate surveillance at the warehouse, using the network of street children to monitor any suspicious movement. The businessman would be responsible for being ready to act as soon as the documents were recovered. His part would be the most difficult. He would need to find a way to present the evidence to the authorities in a way that it would be taken seriously, despite his compromised situation. When night arrived, the girl did something that surprised everyone present. She opened her mouth and emitted a low sound, not words, but a long, melodic moan that sounded almost like a lullaby. It was the first time that her voice had been heard since they met. Rip smiled with tears in his eyes. She always does that when she's about to do something very dangerous, he explained. It's like she's saying goodbye, just in case. The businessman realized that that extraordinary girl had become much more than a simple helper in his personal tragedy. She was the key to unraveling a complex conspiracy, the silent witness to crimes that might have remained hidden forever, and above all, a powerful reminder that courage and kindness can emerge from the most unlikely places. As they prepared for the operation that would take place the next day, he wondered if he would ever be able to adequately repay the sacrifice that child was willing to make for people she barely knew. Thursday dawned with a heavy sky that mirrored the tension in the air. The businessman had barely managed to sleep, watching the girl, who remained awake, organizing and reorganizing her drawings as if she was memorizing every detail for the mission that was approaching. The baby slept peacefully, oblivious to the gravity of the situation that was unfolding around him. Rip arrived before dawn with disturbing news. During the early hours of the morning, his sources in the street children's network had reported unusual movement at the warehouse. Cars different from the usual ones had arrived, and there were signs that the criminal operation was preparing for a significant change. "They're going to move your wife," Rip said, his voice filled with urgency. "Probably tonight. If we don't act now, we may lose her forever." The girl heard these words, and her expression hardened with a determination that was frightening to see in someone so young. She picked up her drawing materials and quickly sketched a new map, this time showing alternative routes and observation points that would allow them to monitor both the warehouse and the office simultaneously. The original plan needed to be drastically modified. Instead of waiting for the afternoon, when there would be less movement, they would have to act during the morning, taking advantage of the period when most of the criminals would be sleeping after their nocturnal activities. It was riskier, but it was also the only opportunity they had. During the first hours of the morning, Rip's network positioned itself strategically throughout the city. Children and teenagers who knew every alley, every abandoned building, every escape route spread out like an invisible web of surveillance. It was impressive to observe how that informal organization functioned with military precision. The girl prepared for her part of the mission with rituals that revealed her experience in dangerous situations. She chose clothes even darker than normal, tied her hair so that it would not obstruct her vision, and checked each simple tool she would take. A small screwdriver found in the trash, a piece of flexible wire, and a small mirror to observe around corners without being seen. The businessman watched her with a mixture of admiration and horror. A 4-year-old child who appeared to be only 2 was preparing to break into the office of a dangerous criminal, and she was doing it with professional competence that many adults would not possess. Life on the streets had forged in her skills that no school could teach. Before leaving, she did something unexpected. She approached the sleeping baby and gently touched his forehead as if she was blessing him or saying goodbye. Then she looked at the businessman, and for the second time since they met, emitted a sound, this time a sequence of syllables that almost formed words, but that he could not understand completely. "She's trying to say, 'Be careful,'" Rip translated. It's one of the few words she can still form when she's very emotional. The building where the majority partner's office was located was a modern construction of glass and steel in the city center, with seemingly sophisticated security, but which had weak points that only someone with the girl's urban survival knowledge could identify. She had mapped every camera, every sensor, every patrol pattern during her previous observations. The infiltration happened during the security shift change period, a 15-minute window that she had timed with impressive precision. Using ventilation pipes and architectural structures that adults would consider inaccessible, she managed to reach the correct floor without being detected. Meanwhile, from the observation point that Rip had established, the businessman watched nervously through borrowed binoculars. He could see her occasionally through the windows of the building, a small and agile figure moving through the shadows with abilities that defied his understanding. Entering the office itself was the riskiest part of the operation. The girl needed to disable a simple alarm using knowledge she had acquired by watching technicians working in other buildings. Her small hands manipulated wires and circuits with extreme care, and for some terrifying moments the businessman thought she had been discovered. But she succeeded. The door opened silently, and she disappeared inside the luxurious office that contrasted drastically with the poverty in which she lived. It was an environment of power and wealth, decorated with expensive works of art and furniture that cost more than most people earned in years. The safe was exactly where her drawings indicated, hidden behind a painting that she had memorized in detail. But opening it would be impossible for someone of her age and size. That's when the second part of the plan came into action. She photographed the safe combination using a small digital camera that Rip had managed to get, recording the numbers that she had observed being typed during previous visits. But what she found inside the safe exceeded all expectations. It wasn't just the documents that proved the businessman's innocence. It was evidence of a much larger criminal operation involving not only financial fraud, but also kidnappings, extortions, and disappearances that spanned years. There were photographs, contracts, recordings, and correspondence that documented crimes against dozens of families. The girl worked quickly, photographing each document with methodical precision. Her movements were efficient and silent, demonstrating impressive concentration for someone so young. She knew that every second in the office increased the risk of discovery, but she also understood that this might be the only opportunity to expose the whole truth. It was during this process that something unexpected happened. She heard voices approaching down the hallway. It wasn't the scheduled time for anyone to be in the building. Her heart raced, but she remained calm, continuing to photograph documents while mentally planning her escape route. The voices became closer, and she could distinguish the familiar voice of the businessman's majority partner. He was discussing details about the final transfer of the merchandise, a reference clearly related to the kidnapped wife. They planned to move her that very afternoon, much earlier than Rip had predicted. The girl finished photographing the documents and silently headed for her escape route, but discovered that the path was blocked. The men had positioned themselves in the main hallway, and she was temporarily trapped in the office. For some terrifying moments, it seemed that the entire operation was doomed to fail. It was then that she demonstrated her ingenuity once again. Using the building's internal ventilation, she managed to move to an adjacent office where a window provided access to an external air conditioning system. It was an extremely dangerous path, but it was her only option. From the observation point, the businessman and Rip watched in horror as she appeared on the outside of the building, dozens of feet above street level, moving carefully along metal structures that seemed incapable of supporting even her light weight. One false move would result in a fatal fall, but she made it. With skills that seemed to defy the laws of physics, she descended the outside of the building using pipes, decorative structures, and architectural irregularities as supports. When she finally reached street level through a side alley, she was trembling not from fear, but from adrenaline and exhaustion. The reunion at the meeting point was emotionally intense. The girl handed the camera to Rip with hands that trembled slightly, and for the third time since they met, she tried to speak. This time she managed to form a complete word. Today, "They're going to move your wife today," Rip translated, confirming what she had heard in the office. "We don't have any more time for elaborate planning. We have to act immediately." The photographs she had taken were even more revealing than they had expected. Not only did they prove the businessman's innocence, but they also showed the exact location where his wife was being held, the guard shift times, and most importantly, evidence that she was being forced to sign documents that transferred properties and investments to accounts controlled by the criminals. "She's not just a hostage," the businessman realized, studying the images. "They're using her to access assets they couldn't steal directly." The situation was even more urgent than they had imagined. His wife was not only at risk of death, but was being used as a tool for additional financial crimes that could destroy other innocent families. Time was running out quickly, and they would need a miracle to save her before she was transferred to an unknown location. The girl picked up her drawing materials one last time and began to sketch a detailed map of the warehouse, including information she had collected during her infiltration of the office. It was a rescue plan that would require courage, precision, and a considerable dose of luck. The rescue plan took shape over the following hours, but brought with it a discovery that would completely shake the businessman. While studying the photographs of the documents found in the safe, Rip noticed something that had initially gone unnoticed, a series of bank transfers that showed a specific pattern of fund movement. "Look here," Rip said, pointing to a sequence of transactions. "These transfers started 3 months before your son was born. Someone was preparing this operation a long time ago." The businessman examined the documents with growing horror. It wasn't just an opportunistic fraud. It was an elaborate plan that had been executed over months, with every detail carefully orchestrated. His signatures had been systematically forged, his bank access codes compromised, and even his social interactions monitored. The girl, observing his shocked expression, picked up a pencil and began to draw again. This time, her illustrations showed scenes that she had witnessed long before the night of the storm. Secret meetings in expensive restaurants, conversations in cars parked in isolated locations, and most importantly, his wife being followed during her daily activities in the final weeks of her pregnancy. She knew she was being watched, the businessman realized, studying the drawings. That's why she was so nervous and worried. The documents revealed that his wife had discovered irregularities in the company's investments and had begun her own discreet investigation. She had identified suspicious transfers to shell companies and financial movements that didn't make sense from a business point of view. Her questions had alerted the criminals to the risk she posed. Rip discovered something even more disturbing in the photographs. "She wasn't kidnapped just to be silenced," he said, showing a series of contracts. "They need her alive to complete some transfers that require her signature as a co-owner of certain investments." The situation was more complex than they had imagined. The businessman's wife had been kept alive not out of mercy, but because her signature was needed to access funds that were in joint accounts. The criminals had spent months preparing false documents that would legitimize these transfers, but they needed her forced cooperation. The girl drew a temporal sequence that showed the real timeline of the operation. The birth had been artificially induced 2 weeks earlier than planned, creating an emergency situation that allowed the criminals to completely control the circumstances. The nurse who had cared for her in the hospital was part of the conspiracy, administering sedatives that kept the mother unconscious while the baby was taken. "They planned to use the baby as a form of blackmail," Rip continued, interpreting the drawings and documents. "They would keep you away while forcing her to sign the documents under threat of harming the child." The businessman felt an anger rising in his chest, an emotion that he hadn't experienced in years of privileged and controlled life. These criminals had not only stolen his fortune, built through years of hard work and careful investments. They had turned the birth of his son into a tool of psychological torture. The network of street children continued to monitor the warehouse during the morning, reporting movements that confirmed the worst fears. 3 dark vans had arrived, and there were evident preparations for a major transfer. Boxes were being loaded, medical equipment being moved, and the surveillance pattern had intensified significantly. "We have a few hours at most," Rip calculated, coordinating the information that was arriving through his network. "After that, she may disappear forever." The girl got up and walked to where the baby was sleeping peacefully. For the first time since they had met, she picked him up without hesitation, holding him with natural confidence. It was as if she was connecting emotionally with the child, preparing herself for what was to come. The rescue plan that took shape was risky to the extreme, but it was the only viable option, considering the limited resources and the scarce time. The girl would use her infiltration skills to enter the warehouse during the afternoon shift change, at which time there would be less surveillance. Rip would coordinate the necessary diversion to attract the attention of the guards, while the businessman would be responsible for alerting the authorities at the exact moment. But it was during the final preparation that something happened that changed everything. The girl, still holding the baby, suddenly froze and began to tremble violently. Her eyes widened with terror, and she emitted a sound that was part muffled scream, part desperate lament. Rip immediately recognized the signs. "She's having a flashback," he explained, carefully approaching her. Something reminded her of the original trauma. The businessman watched with growing understanding as the girl struggled against memories that haunted her. She repeatedly pointed to the baby, then to herself, making desperate gestures that seemed to try to communicate something crucial. It was Old Man Joe, who had arrived to help in the operation, who finally understood. "She had a brother," he said with a choked voice. "A baby, who was taken on the same night she witnessed. What happened to her mother?" The revelation struck everyone like lightning. The girl wasn't just helping strangers out of kindness. She was reliving her own tragedy, trying to save a baby because she hadn't been able to save her brother. Her skills in caring for small children, her instant connection with the businessman's son, it all made sense now. Rip picked up the notebook where he documented information about missing children and found records that confirmed the suspicion. A woman had been murdered 9 months ago, and her baby of a few months had disappeared on the same night. The only witness had been a 4-year-old girl who lost the ability to speak after the trauma. "The same group," the businessman murmured, connecting the dots. "They've done this before. How many families?" The girl gradually calmed down, but her determination had intensified to an almost frightening level. She wasn't just trying to save his wife, she was fighting against the monsters that had destroyed her own family. It was a personal battle that transcended any feeling of altruism. The hours of the afternoon passed quickly while the final preparations were made. Rip's network positioned itself strategically around the warehouse, each child knowing exactly his or her role in the operation. Old Man Joe organized an escape route through the alleys that he knew better than anyone. Mrs. Rosa prepared a basic medical kit in case the businessman's wife needed immediate care. When the moment arrived, the girl said goodbye to the baby in a way that broke the heart of everyone present. She hummed softly, the same melody that she had made the night before, but this time with an emotional intensity that revealed that she knew the risk she was taking. The infiltration of the warehouse was even more dangerous than the entry into the office. The place was heavily guarded, with armed men patrolling perimeters that she needed to cross, using skills that seemed impossible for someone her size. She moved through the shadows like a ghost, taking advantage of every distraction created by Rip's team. From the observation point, the businessman watched through binoculars, his heart beating so hard that he feared it could be heard. Seeing that brave child risking her life to save his family created in him a mixture of gratitude, admiration, and guilt that was almost unbearable. The girl managed to reach the area where his wife was being held, and what she saw through a small window confirmed his worst fears. The woman was visibly weakened, connected to medical equipment that apparently kept her sedated. There were documents scattered on a nearby table, awaiting forced signatures. But it was at that moment that something went wrong. One of the guards noticed movement where there shouldn't be anyone, and cries of alarm began to echo throughout the complex. The girl had been discovered, and the entire operation was about to fall apart. What happened in the following minutes would test not only the courage of a traumatized child, but also the ability of an entire community of people forgotten by society to unite to protect the innocent. The chaos that followed the discovery of the girl in the warehouse revealed an impressive coordination on the part of the network of street children. The moment the cries of alarm echoed, Rip activated a contingency plan that had been prepared for exactly that situation. Homemade fireworks began to explode at different points around the complex, creating multiple simultaneous distractions. The girl, even after being discovered, didn't panic. Her traumatic experiences on the streets had taught her to remain calm under extreme pressure. She moved quickly but silently, using her small stature to hide in spaces that adults would not consider possible. It was like watching a deadly dance between predator and prey, where the prey possessed unexpected advantages. From the observation point, the businessman watched with horror and admiration as that brave child navigated a labyrinth of dangers. Guards ran in all directions, confused by the multiple explosions and unable to locate the real source of the intrusion. It was evident that they completely underestimated the capabilities of a 4-year-old girl. During the confusion, the girl achieved something extraordinary. She located not only his wife, but also discovered where other hostages were being held. Through a series of small windows, she saw at least 3 other people in similar conditions, all apparently sedated and connected to medical equipment. Rip had positioned some of the older children with cameras to document everything they could during the chaos. It was an impressive intelligence operation conducted by people that society considered invisible and worthless. They were collecting evidence that could expose a criminal network much larger than anyone had imagined. The girl finally found a way to communicate with his wife. Through small signals at the window, she managed to get the sedated woman's attention. For some precious moments, the businessman's wife's eyes focused, and she seemed to recognize that someone had come to help her. It was at that moment that something happened that none of them had foreseen. The nurse who had participated in the kidnapping appeared in the room where the wife was being held, but her expression was not that of someone who was coming to administer more sedatives. There was something different in her body language, something that suggested internal conflict. The girl watched through the window as the nurse checked the medical equipment, but instead of adding medications, she seemed to be reducing the dosages. Her movements were nervous, and she constantly looked over her shoulder as if she feared being discovered. It was evident that something had changed in her loyalty to the criminals. During the following minutes, it became clear that the nurse was trying to help the businessman's wife regain consciousness. She disconnected some of the sedation equipment and began to administer what appeared to be mild stimulants. It was a dangerous act of rebellion that could cost her her own life if it were discovered. The businessman's wife gradually began to awaken from her semi-conscious state. Her eyes became more alert, and she began to respond to the nurse's urgent whispers. It was evident that the woman was trying to explain the situation and prepare the wife for a possible escape attempt. The girl realized that a unique opportunity was developing. The nurse had clearly switched sides for some reason, and the businessman's wife was more conscious than she had been in weeks. If they could coordinate their efforts, perhaps it was possible not only to carry out a rescue, but an escape that would free all the victims being held in the complex. Using her knowledge of silent communication, the girl managed to draw the nurse's attention to her presence at the window. The woman was initially terrified, thinking it was another guard, but when she saw that it was a small child, her expression changed to confusion and then to growing understanding. The nurse approached the window, and for some crucial moments, she and the girl established a rudimentary form of communication through gestures. The nurse indicated that there were keys that could open other rooms, showed where the guards were positioned, and most importantly revealed that there was an escape route through the basement that the criminals did not know about. During this silent exchange of information, the girl made a discovery that left her distraught. In one of the adjacent rooms, through a partially open door, she saw a small child, a baby of approximately 6 months, who was crying softly in a makeshift crib. Her heart stopped for a moment, and she wondered if she had finally found her missing brother. The emotional intensity of that moment almost paralyzed her. Months of trauma, pain, and loss converged in an instant of desperate hope. But even amid the whirlwind of emotions, she maintained her ability to think strategically. If that baby was her brother, she would need to save him along with all the other victims. The nurse, seeing the girl's reaction to spotting the baby, nodded gravely and made gestures that confirmed her suspicions. That child had been held there since the disappearance months ago, being used as a means of psychological control over other victims who had tried to resist the criminals. At that moment, the rescue plan evolved into something much more ambitious and dangerous. It was no longer just about saving the businessman's wife, but about freeing all the victims and reuniting a family that had been brutally separated. The girl made a courageous choice that would define not only her own destiny, but that of several other innocent people. She gestured to the nurse that she needed a few minutes to coordinate with her allies on the outside. Using a route that she had memorized during her infiltration, she managed to move back to a position where she could signal to Rip without being detected by the guards, who were still running around in circles, looking for intruders. Rip, seeing the urgent signals from the girl, immediately understood that the situation had become much more complex. He coordinated with his network to create additional distractions, this time directed at allowing not just a rescue, but a mass evacuation. It was an operation that would require perfect timing and extraordinary courage from people who had already lost almost everything. During the preparations, the nurse continued working to awaken not only the businessman's wife, but also the other victims. It was a risky process, as people who had been sedated for weeks would need time to regain coordination and mental clarity sufficient to participate in an escape. The businessman's wife, now significantly more alert, managed to whisper crucial information to the nurse. She revealed where she had hidden additional evidence before being kidnapped, documents that she had copied and saved as insurance against exactly the situation she was in. Safe, central bank, key is in wedding ring, she managed to murmur, touching the finger where she still wore her wedding band. It was information that could not only prove her husband's innocence, but completely destroy the criminal organization that had ruined so many lives. The nurse understood the importance of that revelation and immediately began to help the wife recover the ring, which apparently had been modified to contain a small digital key. It was an impressive level of planning and foresight from a woman who had perceived the danger long before it completely materialized. Meanwhile, on the outside, the businessman made a decision that would change the course of everything. He could no longer remain passive while that brave girl risked her life to save his family. Using Rip's cell phone, he began to make calls to journalists and authorities, preparing the ground to publicly expose everything that was happening. Time was running out quickly. The guards were beginning to organize themselves better, and they would soon discover that their victims were being released from their states of sedation. The window of opportunity for a successful escape was closing, and everyone involved knew that they would have only one chance to get it right. The girl returned to her position near the window, where she found the nurse and the businessman's wife prepared for the riskiest attempt of their lives. It was the moment of truth, where months of planning, desperate courage, and an unlikely alliance between people from completely different worlds would be tested under extreme pressure. But as they prepared to act, none of them realized that they had been watched by someone who would completely change the course of that rescue operation. The silent observer who had been monitoring the rescue operation was the businessman's own majority partner. He had arrived at the warehouse an hour earlier than planned, suspicious of the series of explosions and unusual movement around the complex. His paranoia, developed over years of criminal activities, had alerted him that something was seriously wrong with the security of his operation. Hidden in a strategic position that allowed him to observe both the interior and the exterior of the warehouse, he had witnessed the entire sequence of events, from the girl's infiltration to the nurse's change of loyalty. His expression was a mixture of perverse admiration for the audacity of the operation and growing fury at the threat it posed to his multi-million-dollar businesses. The girl, completely unaware of the presence of the true architect of her personal tragedy, was coordinating the final preparations for the escape. She had managed to communicate to the nurse the basic plan. They would have exactly 15 minutes during the next shift change to move all the victims through the escape route through the basement. The millionaire's wife, though still weak from weeks of sedation, displayed an iron resolve that impressed Nurse Mallory. "My baby," she whispered repeatedly, referring to the child she hadn't been able to hold since birth. "Where's my baby?" Nurse Mallory tried to explain in hushed tones that the baby was safe, but couldn't give details about its location for fear of compromising the operation. Unbeknownst to her, the majority partner could hear every word through the listening system he'd installed in every room to monitor the victims. Over the next few minutes, the criminal made a calculated decision that would turn the rescue into a deadly trap. Instead of stopping the escape immediately, he decided to let it begin, planning to capture everyone involved, including the network of street kids, in one fell swoop. It was a strategy that would eliminate all witnesses at once. Nurse Mallory, whose first name was Paige, had switched sides for reasons that deeply touched her professional conscience. Trained in medicine with a specialty in pediatrics, she'd been coerced into participating in the criminal operation through threats against her own family. But seeing children used as tools of blackmail had finally broken her moral resistance. "There are other babies," she whispered to the millionaire's wife as she helped her up from the makeshift hospital bed. "Children who have been separated from their families. We need to save them too." The revelation that the criminal operation involved multiple kidnapped children added a desperate urgency to the situation. The millionaire's wife, even in her weakened state, immediately understood that she couldn't escape leaving other mothers to endure the same agony she had experienced. The street urchin, watching through the window, saw as Paige began moving the conscious victims towards the cellar entrance. It was a slow and dangerous process, as some of the people had been kept sedated for months and could barely walk. Each step was a battle against time, physical weakness, and the constant risk of discovery. It was at this moment that the baby in the adjacent room, possibly her lost brother, began to cry louder. The sound pierced the thin walls of the improvised warehouse, echoing in a way that would surely alert any nearby guard. The street urchin realized she needed to silence the child before the entire plan was compromised. Using her infiltration skills, she managed to enter the room where the baby was being held. What she saw left her emotionally devastated. It was definitely her brother, thinner and paler than he should be, but alive and seemingly without serious injuries. For a moment she was paralyzed by the intensity of the emotion of reuniting with the only family she had left. But her survival instincts prevailed over the emotional shock. She picked up the baby carefully, soothing him with the same melody she had hummed to the millionaire's son. It was extraordinary how her voice, lost due to trauma, returned instinctively when it came to caring for small children. The majority partner, observing this entire sequence through security cameras the fugitives didn't know existed, made his final decision. He activated an automatic locking system that would seal all the exits of the warehouse, turning the location into a prison from which it would be impossible to escape. Paige, guiding the group of victims through the basement corridors, suddenly heard the metallic sound of automatic locks activating. Her heart sank as she realized they had fallen into an elaborate trap. The escape route she knew was now blocked, and they were trapped in an underground labyrinth with no apparent exit. The street urchin, carrying her brother, immediately realized something had gone wrong when she tried to return the way she had come. The passages that moments before were open were now sealed by metal gates that hadn't existed when she had infiltrated the complex. Outside, Rip and his network of observers watched in horror as the entire warehouse turned into a fortress. Emergency lights came on, sirens began to blare, and armed men emerged from positions that no one had noticed before. It was evident that the entire operation had been a trap from the beginning. The millionaire, watching the unfolding tragedy through binoculars, felt a despair that went beyond anything he had experienced during his own financial downfall. That brave street urchin, who had risked everything to help him, was now trapped along with his wife and her own brother in a situation that seemed to have no solution. Inside the warehouse, Paige tried to remain calm as she assessed her limited options. The group of victims she was trying to save included not only the millionaire's wife, but also a retired accountant who had discovered irregularities in pension funds, an investigative journalist who had gotten too close to the truth, and a lawyer who had represented families of previous victims. "There's an emergency generator," Paige whispered, remembering the technical schematics she had studied when she started working at the location. "If we can shut it down, maybe we can open the electronic locks manually." The street urchin, even carrying her brother, once again demonstrated her exceptional abilities by identifying the location of the generator through sounds and vibrations that the adults couldn't detect. Her months of living on the streets had sharpened her senses so that she could navigate complex environments using clues that others would ignore. But reaching the generator would require passing through areas where guards were positioned. It was a near impossible mission, especially considering that she was now carrying a baby who could cry at any moment, alerting all security to their position. It was at this moment of apparent despair that Paige revealed a piece of knowledge that would change everything. "There are maintenance tunnels that connect this cellar to the city's sewer system," she said, pointing to a small grate on the floor that had been painted to look like part of the foundation. "That's how they move. Special goods without being seen." The revelation that the criminals themselves had created an alternative escape route offered unexpected hope. But accessing these tunnels would require removing a metal grate that was seemingly welded in place, and doing so without attracting attention would be virtually impossible. The millionaire's wife, gathering strength she didn't know she possessed, approached the street urchin holding the baby. "You saved my son," she whispered, gently touching the brave child's face. "Now we're going to save yours." At that moment, an unlikely alliance formed between women from completely different worlds, a businesswoman educated in private schools and prestigious universities, a nurse who had lost her moral compass, and a 4-year-old street urchin who possessed enough courage to face adult criminals. Together, they represented something the majority partner hadn't considered in his calculations: the determination of mothers willing to do anything to protect their children. The operation to access the escape tunnels began with Paige using medical instruments to try to loosen the bolts on the grate, while the millionaire's wife kept watch, and the street urchin soothed not only her brother, but also the other children who had been discovered in adjacent rooms. But as they worked against time, none of them realized that the majority partner had personally descended into the cellar, determined to finish what he had started months ago. He carried not only weapons, but also documents that would reveal the full extent of his criminal operation, evidence he planned to use to blackmail authorities if he were captured. The final confrontation between limitless greed and desperate courage was about to take place in the dark tunnels beneath the city, where the fate of multiple families would be decided in the next few hours. The sound of bolts being loosened echoed through the cellar corridors, like drums announcing an impending battle. Paige worked with surgical precision, her hands trained for delicate procedures, now applying the same skill to free the victims from a prison she herself had helped create. Each movement was calculated to minimize noise, but metal against metal inevitably produced sounds that seemed amplified in the tense silence. The street urchin had positioned her brother in a protected corner, where other smaller children huddled like frightened birds. Her ability to organize and reassure the younger children was impressive. She used gentle gestures and facial expressions that communicated safety even when the situation was far from safe. It was like watching a prematurely matured mother caring for her brood amidst danger. The millionaire's wife, still fighting against the residual effects of prolonged sedation, forced her body to obey commands that seemed impossible. Her muscles protested against every movement, but her determination to save not only herself, but all the other victims kept her functioning beyond her normal physical limits. It was during these critical moments that they heard footsteps descending the cellar stairs. Not the hurried footsteps of guards, but the measured and confident stride of someone who completely controlled the situation. The majority partner had decided to personally oversee the conclusion of his operation, bringing with him a presence that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the confined air. "Did you really believe you could outsmart me?" His voice echoed through the corridors, laden with arrogance and calculated cruelty. A guilty nurse, a woman sedated for weeks, and a mute child, against an empire built over decades. Paige froze for a moment, recognizing the voice that had commanded her life through threats and blackmail for months. But instead of surrendering to fear, something changed in her expression. The presence of the frightened children around her awakened a protective instinct she had suppressed for too long. The street urchin, hearing the voice of the man who had destroyed her family, began to tremble, not from fear, but from a deep rage that she couldn't express through words. Her small fists clenched, and for the first time since the initial trauma, her voice began to form sounds that were almost words, as if the proximity of her tormentor was breaking the psychological barriers that had kept her mute. The last bolt finally gave way, and the grate came loose with a metallic clang that echoed through the tunnels like a cry for freedom. Access to the sewer tunnels was open, revealing dark passages that offered the only hope of escape, but also represented unknown dangers in the city's underground labyrinth. "Move quickly," Paige whispered, starting to lower the smaller children into the tunnel. "One at a time, without making noise." Her instructions were given with the efficiency of someone who had finally found her moral purpose, even if belatedly. The millionaire's wife insisted on being the last to descend, determined to ensure that all the other victims escaped first. It was a gesture of natural leadership that contrasted sharply with her weakened physical condition. She moved like someone who had rediscovered her strength through extreme adversity. The tunnels were even more claustrophobic than they seemed from above. The smell of dampness and decomposition mixed with industrial chemicals created an almost unbreathable atmosphere. The dirty water reached up to the adults' ankles, and the smaller children needed to be carried to avoid drowning in the nauseating liquid. The street urchin, carrying her brother, navigated the tunnels with an intuition that defied logical explanation. She seemed to sense air currents that indicated directions, identify echoes that revealed the presence of distant exits, and above all, avoid areas where the sounds suggested imminent danger. Meanwhile, above them, the majority partner was coordinating a systematic search that included not only his own men, but also corrupt contacts in law enforcement that he had cultivated over the years. His network of influence was far more extensive than anyone had imagined, including people in positions of authority who should have been protecting the law. "Seal all sewer exits within a 2-mile radius," he ordered through an encrypted phone. "And I want teams at the treatment plants. They can't escape by water indefinitely." The escape through the tunnels became a race against time and against virtually unlimited resources. The group of fugitives included people of different ages and physical conditions, from babies who needed to be carried to adults still recovering from prolonged sedation. Each meter traveled was a small but significant victory. Paige, using her medical knowledge to assess the physical condition of each member of the group, made difficult decisions about pace and rest stops. Some of the older victims were reaching the limit of their physical endurance, but stopping would mean allowing their pursuers to catch up. During a forced pause at a tunnel intersection, the millionaire's wife finally managed to tell her complete story. "I discovered the irregular transfers 3 months before the due date," she whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "I started making copies of everything, keeping evidence in places he would never look." The revelation that she had been secretly investigating the fraud for months explained why the criminals couldn't simply eliminate her. She possessed information that could destroy not only the majority partner, but his entire network of collaborators in financial institutions and government agencies. "There's a vault in the central bank," she continued, touching her wedding ring where she had hidden the digital key. "Documents that prove not only my husband's innocence, but also connections to other crimes, other destroyed families, other kidnapped babies." The street urchin, hearing this revelation, had an intense reaction. She approached the millionaire's wife and for the first time tried to form real words. "Mommy? A baby," she managed to whisper, pointing to her brother who was sleeping in her arms. The moment of connection between the two women, one who had lost access to her own child, another who had finally reunited with her lost brother, created an emotional bond that gave renewed strength to the entire group. They weren't just running for their own lives, but fighting to reconstitute families that had been brutally separated. Paige identified a side passage that seemed to lead towards a different industrial area of the city. "This way we can reach a district where I know people who can help us," she whispered, pointing the way with a small medical flashlight she had managed to keep hidden. The new route took them through even older tunnels, parts of the city's infrastructure that had been abandoned decades ago when more modern systems were built. It was like traveling through the subterranean history of the metropolis, passing through layers of civilization that few normal citizens would ever see. During this journey through the urban labyrinth, the street urchin once again demonstrated her extraordinary abilities. She could detect changes in air quality that indicated proximity to the surface, identify sounds that suggested human movement above their heads, and above all, keep all the children calm and organized even in the most challenging conditions. But it was when they finally saw natural light filtering through a distant grate that they realized that their escape had been only the first step of a much larger challenge. The majority partner hadn't only mobilized resources to capture them, he had transformed the entire situation into an information war that could destroy their reputations and credibility, even if they managed to survive physically. "They are wanted as terrorists," Paige heard through an abandoned radio she had found in the tunnels. "Suspects of child kidnapping and organized criminal activity." The complete inversion of the narrative meant that, even escaping the physical prison, They would face a battle to prove their innocence in a system where their enemy possessed enough influence to control the very definition of truth and lies. The exit was in sight, but the real fight for justice was just beginning. Emerging from the tunnels revealed a city transformed into an informational battlefield. Posters with their photographs were plastered on posts and walls, identifying them as dangerous fugitives wanted for kidnapping and racketeering. The majority partner had orchestrated a disinformation campaign so elaborate that even well-meaning people would see them as criminals on the run. Page, recognizing the magnitude of the media manipulation, guided the group through alleys and passages that avoided the main streets where security cameras and curious onlookers could identify them. Her experience in the medical system had taught her how to navigate the city without leaving digital traces, knowledge that now proved crucial to the group's survival. The street urchin, carrying her brother who had awakened and was whimpering softly, showed signs of extreme exhaustion. Weeks of stress, the dangerous infiltration of the warehouse, and now the escape through the tunnels were taking a physical toll that even her extraordinary resilience couldn't withstand indefinitely. But her eyes remained alert, constantly assessing threats and opportunities around her. The millionaire's wife, fighting against waves of dizziness caused by the residual effects of sedation, forced herself to keep pace with the group. "I need to get to the bank," she whispered repeatedly, touching the ring that contained the digital key. "The evidence is the only way to reverse all this." But getting to the central bank under the current conditions seemed impossible. The building was located in the heart of the city, surrounded by sophisticated security systems and constant monitoring. Any attempt to approach it would result in immediate capture, especially considering that their photographs were being broadcast on all news channels. It was during this apparent dead end that Paige remembered a contact who could change everything. "There's a journalist," she said, stopping in a sheltered area under a railway bridge. "Someone who had been investigating irregularities in the hospital system. He suspected I was being forced to do things that went against my medical ethics." The journalist, whose name was Danny Hayes, had tried several times to approach Paige during the previous months, realizing that something was wrong with the treatment patterns in certain hospital wards. His persistence had initially been annoying to Paige, but now represented possibly her only connection with someone who could help them tell their side of the story. Using a public phone in an abandoned train station, Paige managed to contact Danny. The conversation was brief but intense. She explained her situation in coded terms that he understood immediately, considering his previous suspicions about questionable activities in the city's medical system. "Meet me at the recycling depot in the North End," Danny instructed, his voice laden with urgency and professional excitement. "It's a location where I can guarantee temporary privacy and safety, and bring any evidence you have. I need something concrete to contradict the narrative that is being spread." The journey to the meeting point required crossing territories controlled by different urban factions. The street urchin, with her intimate knowledge of the city's social geography, identified routes that avoided both official surveillance and areas where their presence could be reported for a reward. During the journey, something extraordinary happened. Rip's network of street kids, which had spread throughout the city after the initial failure of the rescue operation, began to appear at strategic points along the way. They didn't approach directly, but provided discreet signals about dangers ahead and safer alternative routes. It was impressive to observe how that informal organization of marginalized people functioned with superior efficiency to many official systems. Each child knew their specific role, communicated through codes that only they understood, and above all demonstrated absolute loyalty to each other and to those who had shown kindness in their moments of need. The recycling depot was a labyrinth of mountains of paper, metal, and plastic, organized by workers who knew every inch of the space. Danny had chosen the location not only for its privacy, but because the depot workers had a historical distrust of official authorities and little likelihood of cooperating with unauthorized searches. When they finally met Danny, the first impression was of a man who had spent sleepless nights pursuing a story he knew was bigger than he could prove. His eyes shone with the intensity of someone who had finally found the sources who could confirm his most audacious suspicions. "You're not just victims of a financial crime," Danny said after hearing a summary of their situation. "You're surviving witnesses to what could be the biggest money laundering and human trafficking operation ever uncovered in this city." Danny had been investigating a series of disappearances that followed specific patterns, always people with significant net worth but limited political connections, always preceded by sudden financial troubles, always resulting in property transfers to shell companies controlled by a complex network of intermediaries. The millionaire's wife showed her digital key, explaining about the documents kept in the central bank vault. Danny immediately recognized the importance of that evidence, but he also understood that accessing it would require a strategy far more sophisticated than simply showing up at the bank. "I need time to verify the information you've given me," he said, taking photographs that Page had taken of the documents found in the majority partner's office. "But mostly, I need to find a way for you to access that vault without being captured." It was the street urchin who offered an unexpected solution. She took a piece of paper and began to draw the interior of the central bank, reproducing architectural details with impressive precision. It was evident that she'd been in the building before, probably accompanying someone on official visits, observing and memorizing everything with her extraordinary visual ability. Her drawings revealed service routes, cleaning schedules, security blind spots, and most importantly, a movement pattern of the guards that could be exploited by someone with her infiltration skills. But this time, she wouldn't be acting alone. She would have the support of professionals experienced in investigating and exposing the truth. Danny studied the drawings with growing admiration for the street urchin's observational skills. "She saw things that professional security agents wouldn't notice," he commented. "With this information, I can organize an operation that not only recovers the evidence, but documents the entire process for a live broadcast." The idea of a live broadcast completely transformed the strategy. Instead of trying to access the vault secretly, they would use the media as protection, making it impossible for the majority partner to silence the evidence without publicly admitting his guilt. Page offered to return to the hospital system as an informant, using her medical knowledge and access to records to confirm other victims of the criminal operation. It was a risky plan that could result in her capture, but it could also provide irrefutable medical evidence of the crimes committed. The millionaire's wife, feeling her strength gradually returning, took on the responsibility of coordinating with other families of victims that Danny had identified during his investigations. Many of these families had been silenced through threats or blackmail, but a public revelation could encourage them to speak out. During the preparations, the street urchin did something that surprised everyone present. She approached Danny and after several attempts managed to form a complete sentence. "Want my mommy." It was the first time she had verbally expressed grief for the loss of her mother, recognizing that, although she had reunited with her brother, there was a loss that could never be recovered, but there was also determination in her voice. She wanted justice not only for herself, but for all the families who had suffered at the hands of the same criminals. Danny understood that he was witnessing something much larger than a common journalistic investigation. He was documenting the resistance of people who had lost almost everything, but found enough strength to fight against a system of corruption that seemed indestructible. The operation to expose the truth was scheduled to happen the next morning, but everyone knew that the majority partner wouldn't remain passive in the face of the growing threat to his multi-million-dollar operation. The early morning hours preceding the final operation brought with them a devastating discovery that almost destroyed all the carefully elaborated plans. Danny had spent the night verifying the information provided by the group when he discovered that the majority partner had anticipated their actions and was quickly moving all assets to international jurisdictions where it would be virtually impossible to recover them. "He's liquidating everything," Danny explained, during an urgent meeting at the recycling depot. "Bank accounts being closed, properties being transferred, even the physical documents are being moved to locations we can't identify." The information hit the group like a sentence of doom. The millionaire's wife, who had placed all her hope on the recovery of the evidence stored in the central bank vault, realized that even those documents might have already been removed or destroyed. Years of criminal planning wouldn't leave obvious vulnerable points when the operation was threatened. The street urchin, observing the growing despair on the adults' faces, grabbed her drawing materials and began a series of frenzied illustrations. This time, her drawings showed not only locations and people, but also a detailed temporal sequence of events that she had witnessed during the previous months. It was impressive how her photographic memory had recorded details that no one else had noticed. Conversations between criminals that happened in her presence, assuming that a mute child represented no risk of testimony. Movements of documents that were carried out without concern for irrelevant observers. Account numbers and access codes that were verbalized in front of her as if she were invisible. She saw a pattern, Paige realized, studying the new drawings. They're not just moving the assets. They're preparing to eliminate all evidence and witnesses in a final operation. The drawings revealed that the majority partner had planned from the beginning a final solution that would involve not only the physical elimination of the surviving victims, but also the destruction of any trace of their criminal activities. It was a scorched earth strategy that would guarantee his freedom at the cost of dozens of innocent lives. Danny understood that they had only a few hours before this final operation would be executed. "I need to accelerate the whole process," he said, grabbing his recording equipment. "We're going to have to broadcast live everything we've managed to gather, even if the evidence isn't yet complete." It was in this moment of extreme pressure that the network of street kids once again demonstrated their impressive organizational ability. Rip appeared at the depot with information that completely changed the perspective of the situation. His sources had discovered that the majority partner had made a fatal mistake in his haste to erase evidence. "He's personally moving the most important documents," Rip reported. "He doesn't trust subordinates to handle the evidence that could completely destroy him. This creates a unique opportunity. The information meant that the criminal himself would become vulnerable during the transport of the evidence. It was a tiny window of opportunity, but it represented the only real chance to intercept the evidence before it was permanently destroyed." The street urchins studied the new drawings that Rip had brought, showing the route that the majority partner would use to transport the documents. Her eyes shone with recognition. She knew that area of the city. She had navigated those streets during her months of urban survival. But intercepting an armed criminal convoy would require far more resources than their small group possessed. It was then that Paige revealed a connection that no one had suspected. She maintained secret contact with other health professionals who had been coerced into participating in questionable activities. "There's a network of doctors and nurses who were forced to cooperate through threats to their families," she explained. "People who have access to resources, privileged information, and most importantly, who are desperate for an opportunity to redeem themselves." The revelation that there was an organized resistance within the medical system itself completely changed the possibilities of the operation. Professionals with access to ambulances, communication equipment, medications that could neutralize threats without causing permanent damage, and most importantly, institutional credibility that could legitimize their actions. During the following hours, A complex operation took shape, involving multiple layers of participants. Page's medical network would provide logistical support and institutional coverage. Rip's organization of street kids would offer intelligence and urban mobility. Danny would document everything for immediate broadcast, ensuring that the truth was preserved regardless of the outcome of the interception. The millionaire's wife took on the role of central coordinator, using her experience in business administration to organize an operation that rivaled in complexity any legitimate business venture. It was ironic that the skills her husband had developed building his financial empire were now being used to expose the criminals who had destroyed it. The street urchin would be crucial to the success of the operation, but this time not as a solitary infiltrator. Her observation and urban navigation skills would be used to identify the exact moment of vulnerability of the criminal convoy, while trained adults would assume the physical risks of the interception. But as preparations advanced, it became clear that the majority partner had also prepared for this possibility. His own informants within the system had alerted him to suspicious movement of medical professionals, and he was taking additional precautions that would make the interception even more dangerous. He changed the route, reported one of the doctors from Page's network, through coded communication, and significantly increased security. It seems he knows we're planning something. The information forced a complete review of the strategy with only 2 hours before the planned moment for action. The new route passed through areas of the city where it would be much more difficult to organize an interception without causing collateral damage to innocent civilians. It was the street urchin who offered an alternative solution that no one had considered. Instead of trying to intercept the documents during transport, she drew a plan to access the destination before the convoy arrived there. It was an anticipation strategy that would take advantage of her infiltration experience to position resources at the end point of the criminal's journey. The plan would require perfect timing and coordination between multiple teams, but it offered the advantage of choosing the battlefield instead of reacting to the adversary's choices. Danny could position transmission equipment that would document the arrival of the documents and the reaction of the majority partner when he discovered he had been anticipated. Page would organize a medical support team that could provide immediate assistance to anyone injured during the confrontation, but would also serve as credible witnesses to everything that happened. The presence of respected medical professionals would make it much more difficult for the criminal to claim that the operation was a setup. The millionaire's wife would assume the most dangerous responsibility, personally confronting the majority partner when he arrived at the destination, using her digital key to access the evidence in front of Danny's cameras. It was an act of extraordinary courage, considering her still weakened physical condition. But while they finalized the preparations, none of them realized that they had underestimated the extent of the criminal's informant network. He knew not only about their plans, but had prepared a surprise that would transform their attempt to expose the truth into a deadly trap for everyone involved. The final battle for justice was about to begin, but the odds of success seemed to decrease with each passing minute. The location chosen by the majority partner for the final meeting was an abandoned warehouse in the city's port area, an environment that offered multiple escape routes, but also total isolation from witnesses. When the rescue team arrived at the location 2 hours before the scheduled time, they discovered that they had walked directly into a carefully prepared trap. The warehouse was not empty as expected. Armed men occupied strategic positions, signal jamming equipment blocked communications, and most importantly, other victims of previous operations were being held hostage to ensure the cooperation of anyone who tried to interfere with the criminals' plans. Danny, trying to establish a live broadcast from a hidden position, discovered that all his equipment had been neutralized by sophisticated frequency blockers. "He planned this weeks ago," he murmured, realizing the extent of the trap. He knew that eventually someone would try to expose him publicly. Paige and her network of medical professionals were forced to surrender when they discovered that their own families had been kidnapped during the night as a guarantee of cooperative behavior. It was a brutal demonstration of how the majority partner had prepared to neutralize any threat to his operation. The street urchin, observing the unfolding situation from her hidden positions in the warehouse, realized that all the carefully elaborated plans had been anticipated and neutralized. But instead of panicking, she began to assess the situation with the same coldness she had developed during months of urban survival. Her mental drawings of the warehouse layout identified something that the criminals had overlooked: a series of ventilation ducts and support structures that connected different sections of the building without passing through the areas controlled by the guards. It was a network of passages that only someone of her size could use effectively. The millionaire's wife, held as the main hostage in the center of the warehouse, was forced to watch as the majority partner methodically organized the destruction of all the evidence that could incriminate him. Documents were burned in makeshift drums, electronic devices were destroyed with hammers, and digital files were permanently erased. "Did you really believe you could defeat me?" he said, his voice echoing through the empty space of the warehouse. "I've built this empire over decades, eliminating anyone who represented a threat. You're just the latest in a long list of obstacles removed." But while he spoke, the street urchin had begun a silent sabotage operation that took advantage of knowledge she had acquired observing maintenance workers during her months on the streets. She identified the main electrical systems of the warehouse and began to disconnect specific cables that controlled the emergency lights. The majority partner continued his methodical destruction of evidence, not realizing that small glitches were beginning to appear in his security systems. Cameras flickered intermittently, radio communications developed static interference, and most importantly, the signal blockers began to function erratically. Danny, monitoring his equipment from a hidden position, noticed that brief windows of connectivity were appearing at the moments when the blockers failed. He managed to establish fragmented transmissions that, although they didn't constitute complete coverage, at least documented parts of what was happening in the warehouse. Rip's network, positioned outside the warehouse, noticed the fluctuations in the security systems and began to coordinate a response that would take advantage of those moments of vulnerability. It was an operation of precise timing that depended on the street urchin's ability to continue sabotaging internal systems without being detected. During one of the programmed failures in the electrical system, Paige managed to communicate briefly with other medical professionals who were being held hostage in different parts of the warehouse. She discovered that there were at least 15 victims of previous operations still alive, held as insurance against external interference. The information about multiple additional victims completely changed the nature of the operation. It was no longer just about exposing a criminal or recovering evidence. It was a mass rescue operation that would require coordination between all parties involved to avoid a bloodbath. The millionaire's wife, forced to observe the destruction of the evidence that represented her only hope of justice, made a desperate decision. She revealed to the majority partner that there were other copies of the documents stored in locations he would never discover, lying convincingly to buy time. "Do you really believe I would be so naive as to keep all the evidence in only one place?" she said, forcing confidence into her voice. "There are copies in safety deposit boxes scattered throughout 3 different countries, programmed to be opened automatically if I don't confirm my safety every 48 hours. The lie worked partially, causing the majority partner to pause the destruction of the documents while he considered the implications. He couldn't risk eliminating the victims if it would result in the automatic exposure of his criminal activities. During this crucial pause, the street urchin managed to complete her sabotage of the main electrical system. The lights went out completely, plunging the warehouse into total darkness that would level the playing field between the armed criminals and their potential victims. The chaos that followed the total blackout was intense but brief. The street urchin, who knew the layout of the warehouse perfectly, managed to move in the darkness with efficiency that the adults couldn't match. She located the millionaire's wife and began to guide her towards the evidence that hadn't yet been destroyed. Paige, taking advantage of the confusion, began to release other medical hostages who could help evacuate the more debilitated victims. Her hospital experience had prepared her to work efficiently in emergency situations and limited visibility. Danny managed to re-establish partial transmission during the blackout, documenting the chaos in the warehouse through infrared cameras that worked independently of normal lighting. It was material that, even fragmentary, would be sufficient to expose the extent of the criminal operation. But the majority partner, even in the darkness, maintained control over resources that his opponents didn't possess. He activated emergency generators that had been installed specifically for situations like this and began to coordinate a systematic search that would quickly locate anyone trying to escape. "You've only prolonged the inevitable," his voice echoed through the warehouse when the emergency lights came on. "But now I'm going to make sure there are no witnesses left to tell any version of this story." It was in this moment of apparent despair that something happened that none of those present had anticipated. The network of street kids, coordinated by Rip from the outside, had managed to alert legitimate authorities who weren't on the criminals' payroll. Sirens began to blare in the distance, rapidly approaching the warehouse. The imminent arrival of official reinforcements created a situation where the majority partner would need to choose between eliminating the witnesses quickly or preserving his facade of social respectability. It was a dilemma that his years of operating in the shadows hadn't prepared him to face. The street urchin, realizing that the decisive moment had arrived, made a courageous choice that would define the final outcome of the entire operation. Instead of continuing to hide, she emerged from her hidden position, carrying her brother, and headed directly towards the majority partner. "You killed my mommy," she managed to say, her first complete words directed to the man who had destroyed her family. There was no fear in her voice, only an iron determination to confront the monster that had haunted her nightmares for months. The appearance of the street urchin confronting her tormentor created a moment of tense silence in the warehouse. Everyone present, criminals, victims, and even the reinforcements arriving from the outside, realized that they were witnessing something extraordinary. A 4-year-old child directly confronting the power that had tried to destroy her. It was the moment that would determine whether months of suffering, courage, and sacrifice would result in justice or in more tragedy. The confrontation between the 4-year-old street urchin and the man who had destroyed her family created a palpable tension in the air of the warehouse. The majority partner, accustomed to controlling situations through intimidation and financial power, found himself face to face with an accuser who couldn't be bought, threatened, or silenced through conventional means. "A mute child," he said, his voice laden with disdain. "Do you really believe anyone is going to take seriously the fantasies of a traumatized little girl?" But there was something in his eyes that revealed genuine discomfort in the face of the determined presence of that small figure who stared back at him without blinking. The street urchin didn't flinch. Instead, she approached closer, carrying her brother with one hand and extending the other towards the evidence that hadn't yet been destroyed. "I saw everything," she articulated slowly, each word a battle against the trauma that had stolen her voice for months. The sirens grew louder, and through the grimy windows of the warehouse, emergency lights could be seen approaching. But the majority partner had prepared for this eventuality as well. His corrupt contacts in law enforcement would ensure that any initial investigation would be directed to protect his interests. It was at this moment that Paige made a desperate move that completely changed the dynamics of the situation. She went directly to Danny's cameras, which were still transmitting fragmentarily, and began to publicly confess her forced participation in the crimes, specifically naming other medical professionals who had been coerced through threats to their families. "My name is Paige Mallory, a nurse specializing in pediatrics," she said directly to the camera. "For the past 8 months, I have been forced to participate in operations that have resulted in the separation of families, non-consensual sedation of victims, and falsification of medical records." Her public confession created an official testimony that would be impossible to suppress. Paige's live broadcast began to be retransmitted by other news networks that Danny had contacted during the preparations. In a matter of minutes, the situation in the warehouse became a national event, with millions of people watching as a complex criminal operation was exposed in real time. The majority partner realized that his strategy of controlling the narrative had completely failed. Paige's confession, combined with the images of the warehouse full of victims and evidence, created an irrefutable case against him. His only remaining option was to try to eliminate all the witnesses before the authorities arrived, but the millionaire's wife, taking advantage of the distraction caused by the broadcast, managed to reach the documents that hadn't yet been destroyed. With trembling hands, she used her digital key to access files that contained not only evidence of her own situation, but also records of dozens of other families who had been destroyed by the same criminal operation. "This is the evidence," she shouted to Danny's cameras, raising documents that showed fraudulent transfers, records of kidnappings, and most importantly, a complete list of corrupt authorities who had facilitated the crimes. "Names, dates, amounts, everything is documented here." The revelation of the documents caused visible panic among some of the armed men, who realized that their own names might be included in the evidence. The loyalty bought with money began to disintegrate when the lesser criminals realized that they could be sacrificed to protect the head of the operation. The street urchin, observing the shift in the power dynamics within the warehouse, took an action that demonstrated her intuitive understanding of human psychology. She went to the armed guards and, with her voice still weak but determined, said, "He will abandon you, like he abandoned my family." Her words struck a sensitive nerve. Several of the armed men had been recruited from the same marginalized communities where she came from, and they knew that people like the majority partner wouldn't hesitate to sacrifice subordinates to save their own fortunes accumulated through years of criminal ventures. The authorities finally arrived at the warehouse, but they weren't the corrupt contacts that the majority partner expected. Danny had used his journalistic connections to alert federal agents who operated independently of the local networks of corruption. It was an intervention force that the criminal hadn't managed to infiltrate or buy. The siege of the warehouse was established quickly, with specialized negotiators trying to establish communication with the inside. But Danny's live broadcast had eliminated any possibility of private negotiation. Everything that happened would be witnessed by millions of people. Paige continued her detailed confession, providing names and locations of other victims who were still being held in different locations by the criminal organization. Each revelation triggered simultaneous operations in other parts of the city, systematically dismantling the entire network that had taken years to build. The millionaire's wife, gaining strength with each document she exposed, began to read aloud specific records that proved not only her husband's innocence, but also the extent of the crimes committed against other families. 15 million in stock net worth fraudulently transferred. 6-month-old baby held hostage for psychological control of the mother. False death certificate to cover up kidnapping. Each revelation increased the pressure on the majority partner, who saw decades of careful criminal planning being destroyed in a matter of minutes. His fortune built through sophisticated fraud, his investments in Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies used to launder dirty money, his entire net worth in dollars and euros accumulated through crimes. Everything was being exposed publicly. But it was when the street urchin approached him one last time that the most devastating revelation of all occurred. She took a piece of paper and began to draw something that made his blood run cold. It was a detailed diagram of a telephone conversation that she had witnessed months ago when he personally coordinated the elimination of her mother. The drawing showed not only the location of the conversation, but also specific phrases that she had memorized, bank account numbers that were mentioned, and most importantly, the full name of an important politician who had received payments to guarantee legal cover for the operation. She heard everything, Paige realized, observing the drawing, every word, every detail. A visual and auditory witness that no one took seriously because she was just a mute child. The street urchin's ability to reproduce entire conversations through her detailed illustrations created evidence that no lawyer could contest. It was direct testimony of the most serious crimes, preserved in the photographic memory of someone the criminals had considered irrelevant. The majority partner, realizing that his situation was completely unsustainable, attempted one last desperate move. He offered publicly, through Danny's cameras, to deliver information about other criminals in positions of power in exchange for partial immunity. "I can give names of corrupt judges, politicians involved in money laundering, businessmen who finance operations like this," he shouted, his composure finally collapsing. "There's a much larger network than you even imagine." But his offer of cooperation came too late. The street urchin had provided enough evidence for independent criminal proceedings, and the live broadcast had created public pressure that made any political agreement impossible. The doors of the warehouse finally opened, and federal agents entered to take control of the situation. The majority partner was arrested on national television, his attempts at resistance captured by Danny's cameras for posterity. The street urchin, still carrying her brother, went to the arriving agents. "Want my daddy," she said, referring to the millionaire who had become her father figure during the months of shared trauma. It was a child asking to be reunited with the family she had chosen, not the one she had lost. The rescue was complete, but the real battle, rebuilding shattered lives and ensuring lasting justice, was just beginning. 6 months after the rescue at the warehouse, life had taken turns that none of those involved could have predicted when they first met during that devastating storm. The millionaire, now with his name completely cleared and his fortune recovered through legal proceedings that exposed the full extent of the fraud, discovered that the experience had fundamentally transformed his perspective on wealth and social responsibility. His company, rebuilt with the recovered assets and damages, now operated completely differently. A significant portion of the profits earned through careful investments in ethical stocks and funds was directed to programs that supported families destroyed by financial crimes. His net worth, previously measured only in dollars and properties, now included the immeasurable value of the lives he helped rebuild. The street urchin, whose real name was Willow, had officially become the adopted daughter of the millionaire and his wife through a legal process that recognized the extraordinary bonds formed during the shared tragedy. Her ability to speak had gradually returned through specialized therapy, but her visual and memory skills remained exceptional, now channeled for positive purposes. She attended a special school that recognized and developed her unique abilities, where her detailed drawings were used as an educational tool for other children who had gone through similar traumas. Her art had evolved from documentation of suffering to expression of hope and healing, inspiring other young survivors to find their own voices. Her brother, now healthy and thriving under the loving care of his adoptive family, had developed into a happy child who carried no conscious memories of the trauma he suffered as a baby. The age difference meant that Willow had naturally assumed the role of protective older sister, a responsibility she embraced with impressive maturity. The millionaire's wife had become a lawyer specializing in victims' rights, using her personal experience with the legal system to help other families navigate the complex processes of recovery after financial crimes. Her personal strength, forged through months of captivity and struggle for survival, now benefited dozens of other women in similar situations. Paige had resumed her medical career, but now worked exclusively in programs that provided free health care to marginalized communities. Her experience as a forced perpetrator of crimes had transformed her into a fierce advocate for patients' rights, especially vulnerable children who could be exploited by corrupt systems. Rip, the teenager who had coordinated the network of street kids, had been admitted into a special educational program that recognized his exceptional organizational skills. He now led initiatives that connected vulnerable youth with legitimate support resources, transforming his experience of urban survival into tools for social change. The network of street kids that had been instrumental in the rescue evolved into a formal organization that received funding through the Millionaire's Rebuilt Company. It was an innovative program that recognized that marginalized youth possessed valuable knowledge and skills that could be channeled for constructive purposes instead of merely survival. Danny had gained national recognition for his coverage of the operation, but chose to use his renewed credibility to investigate other cases of systemic corruption. His work had exposed not only the majority partner's criminal circle, but also similar networks operating in other cities, resulting in significant reforms in financial oversight systems. The majority partner himself had been sentenced to decades in prison in a trial that became a national symbol of the fight against white-collar crime. His fortunes accumulated through years of fraud, including investments in Bitcoin and international holdings, were confiscated and redistributed to the families of the victims and programs for the prevention of financial crime. But perhaps the most significant transformation had occurred in the relationship between Willow and her adoptive family. During a quiet afternoon in the garden of her new home, she was teaching her brother how to draw birds when she made a statement that perfectly summarized her journey of healing. "Before I drew caged birds," she said, showing one of her recent drawings where colorful birds flew freely through a bright blue sky. "Now I draw free birds because I learned that even when bad things happen, there can always be good people to help us fly again." The millionaire, watching his adoptive daughter play with his biological son in the same yard, where there had once been only emptiness in his life, reflected on how the storm that had destroyed everything had also brought the most important people into his existence. His wife, completely recovered from her ordeal, held a baby who now knew the love of both parents from the first day of life. The house where they lived had been chosen specifically by Willow, who had used her exceptional visual skills to assess not only the physical structure, but also what she called the energy of the place. It was a home where traumatized children could feel safe, where painful memories could be replaced by experiences of unconditional love. During the nights, when the children slept and the couple talked about future plans, they often returned to the mystery of how a 4-year-old girl had managed not only to survive months on the streets, but also to orchestrate the rescue of multiple families. It was a demonstration of human strength that defied any rational explanation. "She saved much more than just our lives," the wife said during one of these conversations. "She taught us what family really means. It's not about blood or wealth, it's about choosing to love and protect each other unconditionally." The millionaire had learned that his real net worth wasn't in the stocks he traded, the profits he accumulated, or even the income he generated through smart investments. His true fortune was at the dinner table where Willow helped her brother eat, where conversations about the day included both academic achievements and small emotional victories of children healing from deep trauma. The community around them had transformed as well. Mrs. Rosa, the pharmacist who had helped during the first days of the escape, now operated a community clinic funded by the resources recovered from the criminal scheme. Old Man Joe continued to repair bicycles, but also coordinated programs that taught practical skills to at-risk youth. Paige regularly organized meetings where families who had gone through similar experiences could share their stories and support each other. It was a healing circle that was constantly expanding, touching lives that didn't even know they needed help. At one of these meetings, Willow made a drawing that perfectly captured the spirit of transformation that had emerged from the tragedy. It was a large, strong tree with deep roots and branches that extended in all directions. Each branch represented a family that had been saved, each leaf a child who had found safety, each fruit a life that had been rebuilt. "This is our family," she explained, pointing to different parts of the tree. "Not just the four of us, but all the people who help each other. We are a very big family now." And they really were. What had begun as a personal tragedy during a storm had transformed into a support network that extended throughout the city, touching lives in ways that would continue to multiply through the generations. Willow, now 5 years old but with wisdom that transcended her age, had learned that even in the most desperate circumstances, acts of kindness can create waves of transformation that change not only individual lives, but entire communities. Her voice, once lost due to trauma, now inspired others to find the courage to face their own adversities. That night, as she helped put her brother to sleep, she sang the same melody that she had hummed in the tunnels during the escape. But now it wasn't a song of sadness or fear. It was a song of hope, of family, and of the discovery that true love can emerge from the most unexpected places and transform even the darkest stories into tales of triumph and redemption. If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story, giving a score from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.